Hello family, welcome back to Jimmy Stories. Please do remember to subscribe, like, leave your thoughts on the comments section, and also share this video, it means the world to us. Thank you as you do so. Now sit back and relax as we dive into this thrilling story briefly. Brianna was no stranger to hard work. As a single mother of two and a rising star in the legal field, her days were packed with courtroom battles, long meetings, and endless paperwork. That evening, she was eager to return home, where her kids, Jordan and Maya, waited for their favorite dinner, her special jollof rice with grilled chicken. She smiled at the thought of their excited faces when she walked through the door. But as Brianna approached her neighborhood, red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't broken any traffic rules, her registration was up to date, her headlights were on, and her seatbelt securely fastened. Still, she knew all too well the stories of innocent black people being stopped for no reason. Taking a deep breath, she signaled, pulled over, and rolled down her window. A white officer with a stern expression approached her car, flashlight in hand. "License and registration," he barked without explanation. Brianna, ever calm and professional, responded, "Of course, officer." "Can I ask what this is about?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Just do as I say," he snapped. His tone sent a chill down her spine, but she remained composed. She handed over her documents, her hands deliberately steady, to avoid any misinterpretation. As the officer inspected her ID, his demeanor shifted. His face hardened, and he asked, "What are you doing in this area?" Brianna frowned slightly. "I live here," she replied, her voice still calm, but firmer now. The officer's eyes narrowed. "You live here? In this neighborhood?" he scoffed. "I find that hard to believe." Brianna felt a mix of anger and fear rise in her chest. She knew where this was going. "Officer, is there a problem with my ID or registration?" she asked, trying to steer the conversation back to the facts. Instead of answering, the officer took her driver's license and, to Brianna's horror, held it over his lighter. Before she could react, the edges of her ID began to curl and blacken. "This isn't yours," he said smugly. "People like you don't belong here." Brianna's voice shook, but she refused to back down. "What you're doing is illegal. You're destroying my property without cause. My name is Brianna Edwards, and I am a lawyer. I suggest you think carefully about your next steps." Her words seemed to enrage the officer further. "A lawyer?" he sneered. "Don't try to play smart with me." Suddenly, Brianna noticed a second officer approaching the scene. This one, a young black man named Officer Carter, looked uneasy. "What's going on here?" Carter asked, his eyes darting between Brianna and his colleague. "This woman was driving suspiciously," the first officer replied. "Her ID looked fake, so I confiscated it." Carter frowned. "Confiscated? That's not procedure." Brianna seized the moment. "Officer Carter, this man has destroyed my ID and harassed me without cause. I live in this neighborhood, and I haven't violated any laws." Carter stepped closer, inspecting the charred remains of her ID. He turned to his colleague. "Why would you burn this? You had no right." The first officer's face turned red. "Stay out of this," he hissed. "I've got it under control." But Carter wasn't backing down. "No, you don't. This isn't control, this is misconduct." He turned to Brianna. "Ma'am, I'll make sure this is handled properly. Can you wait here while I call our supervisor?" Brianna nodded, her relief mingled with lingering anger. Carter radioed for backup, and within minutes, a senior officer arrived. As Brianna recounted the events, the supervisor listened intently, his expression growing graver by the second. When she finished, the supervisor turned to the first officer. "Is this true?" The officer stammered, trying to justify his actions, but it was clear he was in trouble. The supervisor ordered him to surrender his badge and firearm, pending an internal investigation. Brianna, still shaken, asked Carter for a copy of the report and the supervisor's contact information. Before leaving, she turned to the disgraced officer. "You thought you could intimidate me because of the color of my skin. But you picked the wrong person. I will not let this go." As Brianna drove away, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had ever been unjustly targeted. By the time she reached home, her mind was already racing with plans to file a formal complaint and take legal action. Her kids ran to greet her at the door, their laughter momentarily melting away the tension of the evening. As she hugged them, she silently vowed to fight not just for herself, but for a future where they wouldn't have to live in fear of the same injustice. The next day, Brianna's story made headlines. With her legal expertise and a growing wave of public support, she became the face of a movement demanding accountability and reform in law enforcement. And though the road ahead was long, Brianna knew one thing for sure: she wouldn't stop until justice was served.
Brianna didn't sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, the scene with the officer replayed in her mind: the flashing lights, his smug expression, and the smell of her burning ID. She couldn't let the injustice go unanswered, but she also knew the road ahead would be tough. As a lawyer, she was no stranger to how the system often worked against people like her. The next morning, Brianna called her assistant, Angela, and asked her to push back her meetings. "I need to file a formal complaint and gather all the evidence," she said. "This isn't just about me. It's about the bigger picture." Angela, who had worked with Brianna for years, was already fired up. "Whatever you need, I'm with you. These people think they can get away with anything." After dropping her kids off at school, Brianna drove to the police department, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. She entered the building, her heels clicking sharply against the tiled floor. The receptionist looked up, startled by her presence. "I need to speak with the chief of police," Brianna said confidently. The receptionist hesitated. "Do you have an appointment?" "I don't need one," Brianna replied. "Tell him it's about Officer Trent and an incident of misconduct." The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, but she picked up the phone and murmured something into the receiver. Moments later, a door opened, and an older man in a crisp uniform stepped out. His badge read Chief Robinson. "Ms. Edwards, I presume?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. "Yes," Brianna said, extending her hand. "I'd like to discuss the incident from last night." Chief Robinson led her to his office, where she laid out everything in meticulous detail. She described the unlawful stop, the destruction of her ID, and the racial profiling. To back her claims, she presented video footage from her dashcam. When the chief saw the video, his face darkened. "This is unacceptable," he muttered. "I assure you, Officer Trent's actions do not reflect the values of our department." Brianna wasn't convinced. "With all due respect, Chief, this isn't about one officer. It's about a system that allows this behavior to continue unchecked. I'm not just here to hold Officer Trent accountable. I want to see real change." The chief nodded slowly. "I understand your frustration, and I'm willing to work with you. Let me start by ensuring Officer Trent faces the appropriate disciplinary action." Brianna leaned forward. "I also want a public apology and transparency in the investigation. People need to see that you're serious about addressing this issue." Chief Robinson agreed to her demands, and Brianna left the meeting feeling a small sense of victory. But she knew this was only the beginning. That afternoon, Brianna called a press conference. She stood on the courthouse steps, flanked by community leaders and activists. Cameras clicked and reporters jostled for position as she stepped up to the microphone. "Last night, I experienced firsthand the kind of racial profiling and abuse of power that too many Black Americans face every day," she began. Her voice was steady, but the emotion behind her words was palpable. "This isn't just my story. It's the story of countless others who have been silenced or ignored. But I won't be silenced. I am calling for accountability, transparency, and systemic reform in our law enforcement practices." The crowd erupted in applause, and her words quickly went viral. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForBrianna and #EndRacialProfiling. People from all walks of life shared their own stories, creating a wave of collective outrage and solidarity. Meanwhile, Officer Trent sat at home, watching the news with growing unease. His name and face were plastered across every channel, and public opinion was turning against him. His phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages, many of them hateful. For the first time, he began to feel the weight of his actions. But instead of taking responsibility, he grew resentful. "She's ruining my life," he muttered, slamming his beer bottle down on the table. "I was just doing my job." His wife, Susan, looked at him with a mix of disappointment and fear. "Trent, maybe it's time to admit you were wrong. Apologize, make it right." Trent shook his head. "I'm not apologizing for doing my job." Susan sighed, retreating to the bedroom. Deep down, she knew their lives would never be the same. Over the next few weeks, Brianna worked tirelessly to push her case forward. She partnered with civil rights organizations, spoke at community events, and used her legal expertise to draft proposals for policy changes. Her efforts attracted national attention, and soon, politicians and celebrities were voicing their support. But the journey wasn't without challenges. Brianna faced backlash from some quarters, with detractors accusing her of exaggerating or seeking attention. She received anonymous threats, and her kids began to ask questions she struggled to answer. "Mommy, why are people being mean to you?" Maya asked one evening, her big brown eyes filled with worry. Brianna knelt down and hugged her tightly. "Sometimes, people don't like it when you stand up for what's right. But we have to be brave and keep going no matter what." Jordan, her older son, looked at her solemnly. "You're a superhero, Mom." Brianna smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Thank you, baby. That means everything to me." The day of the disciplinary hearing for Officer Trent arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Brianna sat at the front, her hands folded neatly in her lap, while Trent sat across the room, his expression grim. As the proceedings unfolded, the evidence against Trent was overwhelming. The dashcam footage, coupled with testimonies from Brianna and Officer Carter, painted a damning picture. When it was Trent's turn to speak, he struggled to justify his actions, his usual arrogance replaced by nervousness. The final verdict was clear. Trent was found guilty of misconduct and terminated from the force. The decision was a victory, but for Brianna, it was only the first step. In the months that followed, Brianna's advocacy led to significant changes in her city. New policies were implemented to prevent racial profiling, and a task force was created to address community concerns. Brianna's name became synonymous with justice, and her work inspired others to speak out and demand change. But for Brianna, the greatest reward came one evening as she tucked her kids into bed. Jordan looked up at her and said, "Mom, because of you, people are going to be treated better." Tears filled her eyes as she kissed his forehead. "That's all I ever wanted," she whispered. And as she turned off the light and closed the door, Brianna knew her fight was far from over. But she also knew she had the strength to keep going, for her kids, her community, and herself.
In the weeks following Officer Trent's dismissal, Brianna's advocacy efforts gained unstoppable momentum. She became a leading voice in the fight against police misconduct and systemic racism. Her work wasn't just about holding Trent accountable, but about reshaping the system to prevent future injustices. Brianna collaborated with lawmakers, activists, and community leaders to push for reforms, including mandatory body cameras for officers, bias training, and independent review boards for cases of police misconduct. Her legal expertise and first-hand experience made her a powerful advocate, and her proposals began to take root not just locally but nationally. Despite the victories, Brianna faced continued resistance. A vocal segment of law enforcement and their supporters painted her as an antagonist, accusing her of vilifying the police. She received more threats, some anonymous, others brazen. But she refused to let fear silence her. "If I stop now," she told Angela one day, "everything we've done will be for nothing." Her perseverance paid off. Months later, her city implemented a sweeping police reform package, including the very policies Brianna had proposed. Other cities began looking to her work as a model for change. Meanwhile, Officer Trent's case became a cautionary tale for police departments nationwide, illustrating the consequences of unchecked abuse of power. Though her public fight was bearing fruit, Brianna also worked to heal herself and her family. She enrolled in therapy to process the trauma of the encounter and to help her kids understand the events that had unfolded. Maya and Jordan struggled at first with the spotlight on their family, but Brianna's openness and reassurance brought them comfort. One evening, as the family sat together watching the news, a story about Brianna's advocacy came on. Maya pointed at the screen. "Mom, they're talking about you again. You're helping so many people." Brianna smiled, pulling her kids close. "I hope so, baby. That's why we have to stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it is." The ripple effects of Brianna's courage extended beyond policy changes. Her story united her community, sparking conversations about racism, accountability, and justice. Neighborhood groups formed to strengthen relationships between residents and local police, creating a foundation for trust and mutual respect. Brianna also inspired countless individuals to share their stories and take action. At one event, a young woman approached her in tears. "Because of you, I finally had the courage to speak out about my own experience. Thank you for showing me it's possible to fight back." Those moments fueled Brianna's resolve, reminding her that her fight wasn't just about her, it was about everyone who had ever been silenced or marginalized. Years later, Brianna's name became synonymous with justice and reform. She started a foundation dedicated to fighting racial profiling and empowering communities through legal education and advocacy. Her work continued to impact lives, creating a legacy her children could be proud of. One evening, as Brianna looked out at a packed auditorium where she was about to deliver a keynote address, she thought back to the night that had changed everything. What began as an unjust traffic stop had turned into a movement, proving that one person's courage could ignite real change. With a deep breath, she stepped onto the stage, her heart full of gratitude and determination. She began her speech with the words that had driven her from the start: "This isn't just my story. It's our story. And it's far from over." Brianna's journey wasn't easy, but her resilience and refusal to back down led to meaningful change. She turned her pain into power, her fear into fuel, and her story into a beacon of hope for others. Her fight was a reminder that justice, though often delayed, could prevail when good people refused to stay silent. This conclusion ties up Brianna's story, showcasing her triumphs, personal growth, and lasting impact while ensuring all major themes and plot points are addressed. Let me know if there's more you'd like explored.